Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us. My name is Dee Ryan. I'm the CEO with Limerick Chamber, and on behalf of the team at the Chamber, I'd like to warmly welcome you to this afternoon's interesting, we hope, very interesting session. Before we get started, I'd just like to offer our partner for today's event, Northern Trust, and the site lead in Limerick, Catherine Duffy, an opportunity to say a few words. Catherine.
Thank you, Dee. Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this, what's going to be a great economic insight for us across the sea and both in Ireland. So thank you very much to Carol and to Katrina and to Caoimhe for organising and getting us all ready for this. I think, you know, we all look forward to seeing Carol every year in Limerick. Unfortunately, it's not going to happen this year, but he's promised that he'll come back next year. So Carol, we really look forward to meeting you in person again next year. I hope you and all your family and your friends are keeping well. And as I said, enjoy the session and let's hear what's ahead of us. Thank you very much, Dee.
Thanks, Catherine. That's great. And as Catherine mentioned there, Carl Tannenbaum, the Global Chief Economist with Northern Trust, is a great friend of Limerick Chamber, and through the strength of our connections with Catherine as co-chair of our strategic partner group, and with Noel Gavin, who sits on my board currently, you know, we have a great relationship with Northern Trust, and so we were delighted to be able to persuade Carl to join us this afternoon in Limerick in Ireland, and it's very early in the morning in the US for you, Carl, so we really appreciate the time you've taken to prepare for the session and to join us today. We're going to keep this very conversational and we hope high impact and as informative and as interactive as possible. So when you joined earlier on today, you would have just seen that Caoimhe welcomed you in the chat box, and we'd really like to encourage you to say hi, tell us where you are right now, and drop in there and let us know how things are in your side, your neck of the woods. And also, as questions occur to you as the speakers, as the panelists are discussing what we have set out for them, please feel free to drop your questions there into the chat box. Caoimhe and I will be keeping an eye on it, and we'll be feeding it through to the panelists as appropriate, or we're saving them for the end for with time for Q&A. We're guiding 30 to 40 minutes for the session today. So so please feel free, jump on in with questions, and it's great to have you with us. All right, now in preparing for the session, we decided we were going to look at the flux that we are all in globally, economically, through the perspective of now, next, and beyond. So I might start with you, Carl, and ask you, could you just give us a brief overview of how the COVID-19 pandemic has impacted on the US economy?
Well, first, Dee, I'm delighted to join you. I didn't take much persuading. My heart is still with you over in Ireland. I wish we were together in person, but as many of us are finding out, the video is the next best thing. I'd like to return your nice wishes. I hope everybody who's listening to this is staying safe and well with their families. It is an extraordinary time. In my home, our health related to the COVID situation is fine. Mental health is another question, as many of us are finding out. As we spend more and more time with our families, we find out that perhaps the secret to having a close family is being away from one another for long periods of time. But we're all fine. And I also think that we need to understand that there are a lot of people in both of our countries and around the world that have been displaced by what has happened. Certainly families dealing with the medical emergencies, but also the economic impact that has flowed from that. The numbers that we're seeing, Dee, around the world and in the United States are certainly scary. So many of the economic series that we follow have this character of falling off a cliff, whether it's travel or sales or business formations, really fairly scary stuff. And I think it's okay for everybody to indulge a bit of concern as they look at all of that. But what I wanted to focus on here is really what is in front of us. What is it going to take for economies around the world really to reopen? And I would say there are four curves I'd like everybody to monitor. First is the curve of the pandemic itself. It's very, very important that the growth in new cases fall to a level that is consistent with the resources of our public health officials, as well as low enough so that people feel safe going out and about again. Once those levels have come down, then public health officials can make a decision about how to reopen and when. We're beginning to see reopenings all over the world. By next Monday in the United States, I believe about 65% of the various states and counties will be open for business in one form or another. And so we're very much hoping that that continues, but also it continues without incident, because what nobody wants is a relapse that would force new lockdowns that would be both psychologically and economically very damaging. The third curve, based on the first two, is what companies choose to do. If you're running a small shop or a restaurant and you're not sure that there's going to be demand, you might be very careful about when you reopen. You'll have to face the decision of whether your business requires some physical changes to distance employees, to spread out manufacturing assembly lines, to mask or test for temperatures. All of these things are very, very complicated. There's legal liability, reputational risk. And so I had a chief executive say on a call that I was participating in about a month ago that if you thought shutting an economy was hard, reopening is going to be that much harder. And then the last curve is really how all of us as consumers will react. We've been coached, haven't we, to be quite a bit more careful about what we do and how we do it. And that may take a while to wear off, for us to relax and feel comfortable going back to the shops, to attend a performance or an athletic event, to take a flight, to stay at a hotel. And if you think about all of those things that I just mentioned, there are whole industries, Dee, behind them that are reliant on our willingness to be there and to use their services. And there are lots of people employed in those sectors who may come back slowly because our own tastes will only resume normalcy very gradually. So I've been asked frequently, when are we going to start recovering? And I have good news. The answer is we probably already have. But it's going to be a slow start at first. Hopefully we'll get a little momentum going, but getting all the way back to where we were, let's say last December, Dee, is going to take a while.
Thank you, Carl. That's excellent. And we share an awful lot of those concerns here in Ireland, and we're actually moving through seeing the economy here starting to move through those phases of the slow, as you mentioned, reopening and reawakening. And it is definitely an awful lot more challenging than the shutting down and going to remote working was. So we're seeing some of that here. Katrina, to that, can you perhaps give us an overview of or kind of a recap or summary on where we're at right now in Ireland, and in particular here in the Midwest?
Yeah, so on the 18th of May, we entered phase one of the government's reopening plan. And what that meant was that the construction sector was allowed to reopen in addition to garden centres and hardware stores. Now, obviously, that's abiding by HSE guidance on physical distancing. So those construction sites have reopened at a reduced capacity. And the next phase won't kick off until the 8th of June, and that's when small retail stores will be allowed to reopen and solitary workers will be allowed to return to work. The lockdown, completely shut down some sectors, and it really reduced the operating capacity of other sectors. And that's reflected in the unemployment figures that we've seen published. So at the end of April, we hit an unemployment rate of about 28.2%. So what's included in that calculation are those individuals that are on the pandemic payment, in addition to the enhanced illness benefit, and also those who are officially classified as unemployed in the economy. Now, I would say that based on recent calculations and data that has come out, that probably increased to closer to 29% for the first 2 weeks of May. But what we're starting to see now is that in tandem with the first phase of the reopening plan being introduced, there's a reduction of people who have applied and who are benefiting from some of the income support. So in the last week, we saw 5,000 people come off of the pandemic payment. Now, many people expected that to be a lot higher because they thought, obviously, we have two key sectors that are starting to come back online. But just bear in mind that when you think about those figures and that data that's coming out, when people apply to come off of that payment to say, I'm returning to work, it sometimes there's a lag period of when it's logged. So what we're actually going to experience is that of the people who were paid that pandemic payment on Wednesday, 36,000 of them, it's their last payment. So they are returning to work. Okay, so that's quite significant and we need to take note of that. At the same time, the temporary wage subsidy scheme is probably being credited as the biggest saving grace for businesses, and particularly small businesses in the country. We currently have about 410,000 employees benefiting from the temporary wage subsidy scheme and about 50,000 employers. So again, we'll see fluctuations on that over time. If we think about the supports to date, it's about 2.2 billion that's been spent on health, about 4.5 billion on income support, and about 7 billion on loan guarantees. So it's quite significant, particularly if you compare it against what was been set forward for a hard Brexit, which is about 1.5 billion maximum. So that's kind of where we're at the moment. In terms of the regions, the impact has been fairly uniform. You know, if you look at the specific percentage breakdowns of the working population in each region, that's depending on income support, there's only a variation really of between 0.5 and 1%. So the impact has been quite uniform in that regard. What won't be uniform though is the recovery.
And thanks, Katrina. And there's loads there, and we'll touch more on the recovery a little later. Carl, might I just ask you as kind of a follow-up to that? Katrina gave us an outline there of some temporary measures, some income support measures, and some employer support measures that have been introduced here by the government. I actually haven't had a chance to keep up to date with what's happening in the US in that regard. Has that been consistent across from state to state, or has it been up to each state to introduce different measures?
No, here and actually elsewhere in Europe, there have been a variety of income supports as governments correctly identified this displacement of employees as a real economic risk. First, we need to keep people connected to their jobs because it is a source of networking and skill building for them. And so trying to keep them in place as much as possible is very, very important. Secondly, we do have a lot of families around the world whose incomes are just above their monthly expenses. And so should those incomes decline, they might not be able to afford their rent. They'd be more needy of different types of government support programs. So what you've seen, Dee and Katrina, is in some cases, unemployment benefits have been improved. That's been the key strategy here in the United States with a supplemental $600 per month payment for those who have been displaced. And just for reference, we've had 40 million Americans apply for unemployment benefits, about 1/4 of our workforce. So Katrina cited some unemployment rates of above 20. We will be there very, very shortly. In addition, there have been incentives for small businesses to keep people on their payrolls. We've seen that a little bit in the United States, but that's been the primary tool in Europe, where firms are essentially getting government aid in order to continue paying their employees through all of this. And the good news is that spending, as we just saw in some statistics that came out this morning here in the United States, has been supported by the fact that the incomes that people are not getting from their jobs has been largely replaced by governments. And that's good for everybody because consumer spending is key to both the Irish and the US and really the global economy.
Okay, thanks, Carl. That's very interesting. So similar approaches in terms of recognizing that importance to keep the connection where possible, but to support people in terms of the impact on their own personal income. And when we look at the different sectors that have been impacted, Carl, and moving into the next phase, in Ireland, and I expect similarly in the US, it's retail, hospitality, and the construction sector who were hit. Well, we were all impacted, but whose bottom line was hit directly, immediately, as they had to shutter or halt in some cases their activities completely. When we look ahead into the coming months, there's an expectation that no sector really will remain untouched by the economic impact of this. But specifically, when I look at the banking sector, can you speak to us a little bit about what challenges you feel lie ahead for the banking and finance sector in the coming months?
Poor economic activity is certainly not good for banks, and we're seeing in earnings announcements around the world the expectation of higher levels of loan loss, which are to be expected. The good news is that because we had a banking crisis both in Europe and the United States as part of the 2008 to 2009 experience, a lot of the new management regimes and regulation really stressed financial institutions to have plenty of capital to absorb these kinds of situations. And so far, that seems to have worked very, very well. The capitalization of financial companies in the US and very much so in Ireland after the crisis that was endured in your country have put banks in a very good position to continue to lend. Now, this crisis is very different from the last one. As we've already mentioned, I'm sure Katrina will agree, the speed with which this has hit has probably gone beyond the anticipation of most people in banks. Like others, what we're doing at Northern Trust is just trying to look at all contingencies to make sure that we were very well prepared for both the economic and also the continuity aspects, and Catherine Duffy, who's on the call, has done a wonderful job at that. But the risk is that this goes beyond what we've seen in the past. If there is a second wave of infection, which I would tell you is the biggest risk we all face, you could see some pressure on banks, and so they would do well to look forward to make sure that they're ready for that. And then finally, I would note that so much of finance happens outside of the banking system now. We did see quite a shock to stocks and bond prices in March. A lot of that has been retraced thanks to the measures taken by the Central Bank of Ireland, the Fed, and others in order to bring normal liquidity conditions back. But that doesn't mean that we aren't going to have losses in some asset classes. And so we need to be on the lookout for those portfolios, those countries that might be on the wrong side of what's just occurred.
Thanks, Carl. Katrina, similar question to you. When we look ahead here, where do you see those risks in terms of the sectors here in Ireland and even in the Midwest that would be likely to see a bottom line impact in the coming months?
So as you said, Dee, I think it is fair to say that the sectors that have been most impacted to date are wholesale and retail, accommodation and food services, and construction. We've seen some light with construction, given that it was included in phase one of the reopening. But I do feel that many businesses in retail and in accommodation and food services will continue to struggle, and particularly in the short term. And there's a number of reasons for that. I think firstly, it's the fact that they've had no income for up to 2 months, but at the same time, they have accumulated fixed costs. And I don't think the package that has been introduced by government effectively addresses that position they're in with cash flow and liquidity issues. Secondly, they're going to be required to implement physical distancing, the 2-meter rule at the moment. I know there's discussion about reducing that down to 1 meter, and that's an important discussion because for many of those businesses, when they reopen, they're going to be reopening in a capacity of less than 50%. And for some businesses, it just simply won't be viable for them to reopen at anything less than maybe 70% or 60%. So there's those aspects as well. We have no, and this is leading back to the uncertainty aspect that Carol was highlighting, where we don't know what the timeline is with regards to a vaccine coming online. I think thirdly, there's a significant amount of uncertainty with regards to demand, and whether the demand for bricks and mortar retail has just been deflected towards increased online shopping. And trying to get a handle of that and a grasp of that is difficult because, if last week there was a lot of photos that were put up online about the significant queues outside of Woody's when it reopened. And, some people pointed to that to say, look, that's evidence that we do have this pent up demand in the economy that will be there when...
That's a DIY store here in Ireland, Carl.
Yeah.
They just got to open last week for the first time. We were all very excited.
Yeah, so and that's the thing, because some people are saying that's evidence of pent-up demand, whereas other people are saying, well, actually, it was the most exciting thing that happened in Ireland for 6 weeks, so everybody just went for a nosy, So there's no real way to kind of balance it. Now, when we look at the stats, the central bank did release some credit card and debit card stats on April, and there actually was a fall in e-commerce spending of about 4% year on year from April this year versus April last year, but also between March and April this year. So again, you have the positive economists who are kind of saying, well, that could be reflective that people are saving in order to spend in the shops when they reopen. But then you have some of the less positive economists who are like, well, it could be showing a bigger problem where there's lots of uncertainty in the markets and people are worried and concerned and they're just saving, but it doesn't mean they're saving to spend it when the shops reopen. So there's issues around that. I would also think we need to be concerned about industry and in particular manufacturing as we move along the roadmap, because we are a very small island economy. We feed into and we're closely tied to the fortunes of other countries. So if you think about the manufacturing companies that are in Ireland, they're part of a global supply chain. And when I talk about the risks, I'm not just talking here about a drop in global demand, which would lead to a reduction in exports. I'm also talking about the comparison of our reopening as the country versus the reopening of other countries. Because if we have something that hinders our reopening, we could lose competitiveness, because what will happen is that the supply chain, they look for alternative countries that can offer that at a time when Ireland can't. If we lose that and we lose some competitiveness, that leads to permanent job losses. And it's very difficult. It could take anywhere between 2 to 3 years to regain that employment in that industry or that sector. Specifically with regards to the region, sectoral analysis is so important when we look at the regional impact of COVID-19, because every region in Ireland has a different sector makeup. So if we think about the Midwest, right, we should be looking at the main commercial sectors under really 3 different headings. So we should be thinking about it in terms of employment, in terms of value added to the economy, but also in terms of physical units, okay? So when we think about employment and value added, that's self-explanatory. In the Midwest, the most significant sector for employment is manufacturing industry, followed by wholesale and retail, and then followed by human health. So within that, we have one sector that's extremely impacted. We have another that potentially could face issues based on the global economy. And we have others that hasn't really been as impacted. So it's a mixed bag. It's the same if we look at value added. Again, it's industry and manufacturing that makes the most significant contribution, but then you also have financial services in there, and you have ICT, which people are arguing have been potentially the least impact by what has gone on in the last few weeks. So there's that kind of insulation there for that element. The reason why I would say you also have to take notice of the physical units that exist in each region is because the 2 key sectors for physical units in the Midwest is wholesale and retail, and accommodation and food services. And if we see a significant downturn in those 2 economies, it will lead to vacancy and it will lead to dereliction in our towns and our city centres, which would be a big issue when we're trying to see recovery across different regions. So we have to be conscious of that, I think.
Okay, Katrina, now you've gone into default economist mode there now, and scared the bejesus out of a lot of us. I might also point out, just to counter, and I take your point absolutely. Obviously, you know, you're making excellent points there, and we do need to be concerned about our competitiveness and ensure that we don't get set back in terms of our national competitiveness versus other countries. I will also point to the one good news stories there. I'm aware of a member company in the Midwest who has a telecoms call and communications call center and customer contact center here in Ireland, who actually has been employing and has been taking on people through the period of impact, because unfortunately their overnight call centers in other parts of the world went down with COVID and had to come offline. So they've rushed to recruit here on short-term contracts, and so have helped to provide employment for people who've come free from other sectors immediately impacts like retail and hospitality. But I take your point, Katrina. You know, we should be very cautious. And so with that in mind, you know, when we look into the beyond phase, definitely undoubtedly the role of government and will be key to how individual economies emerge and how they recover from this. Carl, if I could come to you next and just reflect on that and think about President Trump and the protectionist agenda that is being pursued within the US at present. How do you see that impacting on the US economy first, and then perhaps you could speak to us a little bit about on the global economy?
Well, Dee, I hate to be quite so candid, but frankly, I prefer not to think about President Trump whenever I can avoid it. Unfortunately, every day, the headlines are such that the White House is front and center. I think Katrina's raised a number of good points. I think COVID-19 is probably going to accelerate some things that were already underway. And one of them, as you've highlighted, is a new look at globalization. And that's good news and bad news for the United States and for Ireland. And here's why I think that way. Let's not forget that we were going through the free trade is fair trade debate long before we knew about the virus. And we were trying to sort new trade agreements, obviously, between the United States and China, but there were many others that were under review. One of the blessings, if you want to look at it that way, of COVID-19 is that we're talking a lot less about Brexit, but let's not forget that the new outline of the trade agreement between the United Kingdom and the rest of the EU was supposed to have been proposed by the end of next month, and Westminster is refusing, at least for now, to defer that deadline. So the frictions are there as well. As global trade has resorted, though, certainly there are opportunities for American companies, Irish, Canadian, Mexican, that may arise. And here I want to say a few words about what's going on in the Far East. COVID-19 began, at least from most Western medical views in China, they were the first to take the kind of shutdowns that we've now seen commonly in other countries. It also hit the Chinese economy very, very hard because proximity in factories was one of the things that clearly needed to be changed. They were unable really to get shipments in and out, and as a result, the Chinese economy slumped very, very severely in the first quarter. Since then, though, China has sort of reopened, and some of the statistics that we get show that they're making progress. But the problem that they've had is that the concern that was present before COVID-19 about how much we rely on China for certain things has only gotten worse. I'm sure that you followed the story about masks and gowns and gloves, which have been in sharp demand around the world. And it came out that China makes 60 to 65% of those things. And so we're very reliant on that supply. And as they had their own outbreak, they kept most of it for themselves. And when they reopened, unfortunately, the experience that we've had is that a lot of the material, the testing kits have been faulty. And that's really led to a renewed sort of economic nationalism that maybe, at least on a contingency basis, we ought to have more made at home. So as I sort all of this out, as supply chains broadly and globally are reviewed, I think China's probably going to be a net loser. And certainly their actions recently, where they seem to be defiant as opposed to accommodating, in the Hong Kong situation that we're following very closely is part of this. Western Europe and the United States and North America are going to react very poorly to that. And that's going to shift processes in the service space and also manufacturing away from the Far East towards Europe and towards the United States. The last thing I'll say on this is let's not forget that politics is behind everything. And so as you read what's happening in Washington, as I do, please remember that there is this date upcoming in November where we're all supposed to be casting our ballots, whether we do that from our homes or in the polling places or however we do it. And so a lot of what politicians are doing now on both sides of the aisle is to prepare for that day. In Beijing, they know this. They're haircutting a lot of what the president says, as am I, as we lead up to the election. But the rhetoric is just going to be, I think, pretty ugly for the next 6 months or so.
Okay, Carl. So just a lot there, and thank you so much for some very interesting thoughts there. I think we can echo your experience that you've had in the US here in Ireland about the PPE and the face masks coming from China. I think certainly there's been a heightened awareness here amongst everybody of how reliant we are on that global supply chain for items that we use and take for granted here. And so perhaps there's an opportunity if we see that shift. If we might see that shift back to regional manufacturing and production for some sectors, and but the concern is, of course, about what that would do to access to markets, and we want to maintain the access that we have to each other's markets and develop those further. So very interesting. So would you think that perhaps would you be ready to take a bet yet that maybe we've reached peak globalization? Or is it too soon to tell? Maybe are we looking forward to a period now where we're seeing more regional production?
Well, I would say for the time being, we've definitely passed peak globalization. In fact, if you look at the global trade flows, we hit peak globalization probably 4 years ago. And it's good and bad. Look, we often forget that some of the prices that we pay at shops is because of globalization. Some of the advantages that our companies have been able to take up a global environment have come from free and open trade. And so as that begins to contract, I think we're going to find that we'll miss good parts of it. But all of that said, if you're looking for opportunities, they will certainly be there. And I don't want to let the opportunity pass without reinforcing something that Katrina said, which apart from the global trade policies, I think a lot of companies have learned important lessons about resilience. And where they do certain things, service and manufacture. And I think having a more diverse set of opportunities, should one center go down or one place be hit with something, is probably going to lead to a little bit less concentration in different places. And that can create opportunities, I think, for both of our countries.
Okay, great. Thank you. Katrina, when we look at the role that the government had in developing policies to tackle the last recession in Ireland, those were predominantly, they were austere, and so they pursued policies of austerity last time around. What are you feeling is likely on this occasion?
Austerity is a word that has been used a lot, I think, recently, particularly in the media. And I think it's very much how we define austerity, or what we mean by it. When we say it, are we referring to what we experienced after the last crisis? If that's the case, then nobody wants that, and we don't have to return to that. But the way I think is best to probably look at it is that there's 3 stages along this journey, I think. And the first is that the crisis phase, which technically we're still in, where the government was borrowing to, I suppose, protect livelihoods. When we get into the recovery phase, what's going to happen is that the government needs to borrow to boost demand. And that means that there's going to have to be spend in terms of delivering on infrastructure that was committed to prior to COVID-19, and that's included in the project Ireland 2040. We're going to need investment in reskilling and our education system, and particularly investment in R&D, because just to add on to the point you're speaking right there a minute ago with Carol, have we reached peak globalization? I would say we're at a point we've reached peak globalization in the manufacturing, probably with physical goods. I don't think we've reached peak globalization when it comes to digital, or the exchange of ideas and innovation in that sense. So I think where we get to then is going to be our new balance, right? And we don't know yet what that's going to look like. But when we reach that point, we probably will be at a debt to gross national product ratio of somewhere between 114% to, based on what a scenario you're looking at, as high as, I would say, 130%. We're at 99% last year. So, that's quite significant. Our borrowing is going to increase. We cannot avoid that. But we will come to a point when we reach that new balance and we start to see some form of equilibrium again, employment starts to increase again, there will have to be increases in taxation. And that's just logical. But we have to understand why we will see those increases in taxation, because the last time it happened, and that they were so severe after the last crisis, it was because we were doing it really to appease the troika. But when we're doing it now, we're doing it in order to lessen the gap between, obviously, our income and our spend, so that we can continue to invest into the future in things like infrastructure, for sustainable transport, and for education. So as long as we're doing it for the right reasons, I don't think we should be afraid of, at some point when we get to that new balance, being conscious that there will be tax increases. Just to point out as well, we do have support at a European level too, because interest rates are very low at the moment, and that's partly to the efforts of the ECB. You probably heard that there's currently discussion around a grant package of 750 billion, where the amount each country gets would be dependent upon the level of impact. So we don't really know for sure yet what Ireland would be entitled to, but it would be less, like we're probably talking less than 2 billion versus Italy, that would probably be 80 billion in terms of what they would get out of the grant system. But we have a lot of flexibility at a European level that we didn't have pre-COVID-19. That there is the general escape clause that has been moved, that has given increased flexibility, and we have to take advantage of that. So I think we should be borrowing, basically. But what the government has to do and has to recognise is that they have a very big challenge ahead of them in terms of the balancing from when we move to high levels of borrowing versus when we think about restructuring or taxation to offset it, is that we have other challenges, and Carol has already touched upon these. Brexit is one. We don't know what's happening with Brexit. And another thing is international taxation. There's still a lot of discussions and decisions that have to be made at the OECD level about the base erosion and the profit sharing taxation measures, and they could have serious implication for corporate tax receipts for Ireland too. So that's something that has to be brought into any discussion in the future around austerity.
Okay, so but from what you're saying, you would be in favor of government borrowing to continue to fund supports for businesses and families at this point, while we're still in the emergency phase, and to support us with stimulus packages as we move into the recovery phase. How long do you think it's feasible for us to expect the government to be putting its hand in, or the state to be putting its hands in the pocket to support like that?
I think for guidance on that, we have to look to the data and the specific indicators in the economy. We need to look at, I think, with regards to employment, when we start to see employment increase again, when we start to see consumption and spending increase in the economy as well, maybe certain recovery with regards to demand for money, for loans and for potential investment from business. So there's a lot of indicators will dictate when the government can kind of move from one phase to the next on its approach to that.
Okay, so a little early to tell. And we are expecting, of course, the finance department here to continue for a short period. Yes, Carl?
Yeah, Dee, could I just add a thought? I think Katrina made a couple of important points. I hear both here at home and also in other countries a lot of concern about the debt that governments are taking on to deal with this. I'm no great fan of debt. Certainly, a lot of countries have had trouble with it. But I think the way we have to judge what's being done now by our governments is against what would have happened if they hadn't done anything. Yeah. Very, very clear that, at least in my view, that the economic damage that would have been done to households and businesses would have been so severe that the revenue trajectory that they'd be facing would be awful, and they'd have fewer levers that they could pull, because you can't tax a stone, okay? So there will come a day that we have to be very careful about the debt, but right now, as Katrina mentioned, it's inexpensive. There is a backstop coming from the central banks who are buying a lot of it for the time being in order to keep it from being a burden on societies. And that can go on really for quite a while, as she mentioned, until there are really clear signs, not just the recovery has started, but it is taking deep root. And here, I have to say that the last week has been filled with, I think, overly optimistic headlines about what Europe is doing. Speed is important in this exercise. I'm sure Katrina would agree. Every week that goes by, you have another small business at risk. Once some of these benefit programs start to expire, you have households that are at risk. And what you need is to build a bridge long enough and strong enough to get us to that next phase. And of course, the virus plays a role in this. And unless governments are willing to step up and be there for the duration and do the size that it takes, it's going to be a very rough road to hoe. While the European authorities have come forward with a plan, I would point out a couple of things. The 750 billion euros are going to be spread out over a long period of time, and the first of them won't be spent until next year. That plan is going to have to be approved by all 27 remaining members of the European Union. And already you've got some comments from the Frugal Four, amongst others, that this is not going to be that easy to get through. In addition, there's all of the discussion that has to be had about allocations as to, as Katrina mentioned, who is going to get what. And of course, whereas here in the United States, we don't really spend as much time about whether Illinois is getting this or New York is getting that. It's, of course, a big deal in Europe. So one of the reasons why I'm a little bit concerned about Europe, more so than, let's say, North America, is again because the policy response has been slower and smaller and will probably need to be stepped up in order to assure the kind of future that I'm sure we'd like to see for the countries involved.
Okay.
Yeah, actually, like just add to that as well. I would say that Carl is spot on. There are certainly, I think, larger concerns on Europe and the EU, and I think there's a political aspect to it as well, because if you consider the fact that a decision made by the European Court of Justice was overturned by the Federal Court of Germany, which showed that the main power force rests in Germany and not at the EU central. I think it's kind of made some of the very right-wing countries reconsider and maybe assess going the same route as Britain has. So I think that there is a threat, not just to the euro as a currency, but a threat to the European project itself, and that shouldn't be ignored.
Oh, that's obviously very concerning, and I saw that judgment during the week and heard some discussion around the ramifications of it and the implication and what it does to undermine the jurisdiction. And of course, that's something that we will need to look to for the future, and perhaps Ireland will use the strength of its relationships with our European neighbours to try and rally cohesion around the union, because more than ever, as we face into a period of recovery, having access to a strong single market is going to be really important for all of us. Folks, is there anything light you'd like to leave us with? Is there any nice, happy thought for everyone on this bank holiday weekend?
I think you accused Katrina of being full-on economist. You know, we're the people that can find a dark cloud behind any silver lining. But I will have to tell you that, you know, the resourcefulness of businesses and individuals through this, and also the collective compassion, both through the governments and through private means, has been impressive. I mean, for all of the bad data that we get, I'm sure all of us have seen very uplifting stories about communities pulling together and doing things for their constituents. And it's a real testament to the human spirit. We've done probably better to this point than I thought we might have in that regard, because things like this can pull societies apart, as histories will tell us. So the idea that this too shall pass is inspiring. And you know, as I look forward, while there are many risks on the horizon, again, the ingenuity, the inventiveness, the resourcefulness, and the will of our communities is one of the things I think that gives me confidence that we'll see the other side of this.
I might just, for my final comment, I just saw a question from one of the audience members pop up, so I might just address that from Carol, who was asking about the level of the pandemic payment in light of the winning the lotto comments. I'm assuming that's referring to the 350 rate that was set for the pandemic payment, and how there's discussion that it's basically distorting the market somehow, because it's some of the part-time workers would be on a lower rate of pay per week than 350 euros. So it kind of disincentivizes them from returning to work. And that discussion has been in the news and media. And I can understand the concerns. You know, I can understand when you have part-time workers who are maybe working 10 hours, and to make the same, you'd have to put them on an hourly rate, 35 euros, which makes absolutely no sense. So I understand those concerns completely. But maybe just end on a positive note, you might maybe look at it from an alternative angle, because the majority of people who are receiving that 350 euro payment are people that fall within the age bracket of 17 to 24. And they are the group demographically that spends the most money and saves the least money. So that money that is going towards them more than likely is being pumped back into the economy. So that's a different way to look at the discussion that's taking place at the moment. So it's a stimulus effect as well. And I think, you know, we need to acknowledge that too. Now, I don't want to go so far to say if it was purposely done by the government when they initiated it. I think the system was just implemented so quickly that maybe they didn't align it with what we're seeing with the temporary wage subsidy scheme and other supports. But I do think it's a positive outcome from that demographic in particular receiving it.
Okay, thank you, Katrina. And just another question I'll pull in and throw it out to either one of you from the floor, from David Jeffries. Thank you, David. How likely do we feel it is that President Trump will act on the plans he's mentioned recently to bring pharma manufacturing back to the US? I don't know if either one of you would like to tackle that one.
So that's been a great hope of our current president for a while. And I would qualify it by saying I do think that at the end of all of this, there will be more done in North America. It might be in Canada or Mexico. But again, shortening the supply lines, supply chains is, I think, going to be a lasting theme. I will say, though, that supply chains around the world for services or for goods were formed that way for a reason, because they were efficient and cheap. And so undoing them is no small feat, especially if it's a heavier industry where you actually have to build a plant or heat an old one up. That's not easily done. And any of you on the call who work in logistics, you know that this has become an entire science unto itself. And the way that you optimize things, if you put a new constraint in those problems, it's going to be challenging to move them around. What businesses are sensing now, though, Dee, is that this is not going to be a 3 or a 6 month issue. This is going to last a while. The concern with China, the concern over access to things like personal protective equipment, that enables them to make the investments to be ready to start doing things closer to home. And I think we're going to start seeing that come forward fairly soon.
Okay. Katrina, any thoughts there?
Yeah, I think it's certainly something that we need to be concerned about because of the significance of US multinational companies for Ireland. They played a huge role in our recovery after the last crisis. And if you think about corporation taxes, the top 10 firms, which are all multinationals, account for about 50% of that income. So it's very, very significant. I think they offer huge support in whatever recovery we're going to see after COVID-19, because if you look at even stock market prices for tech companies based here in Ireland, they on average saw a reduction of 5.3%. Whereas if you look at the ISEC 20 for Irish companies as a whole, it was a 13% reduction on average. So they're faring better and they're rebounding quicker. And it's similar with pharma companies and medtech companies, where their reduction on average was about 2.3%. So I think it's something that it's something we should certainly be concerned about and recognise their importance to Ireland's economy.
Absolutely, hugely important, and of course, they've made major infrastructural investments, as you noted, Carl, in the region and in the country, and employ a large number of people. So perhaps, Katrina, what I'm hearing you say is that a real focus on upskilling in those areas that have potential growth, and focus on education and investment there over the near term might be a wise investment for us.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm just keeping an eye on the time. I think we've reached our limit, so I'm going to wrap us up. I'd just like to say a huge thank you to Carl for joining us this morning from the US and your time. We really appreciate it, Carl, as always. Really great insights there. We will be circulating the video of this recording and to share it with as many people as possible in our membership. And we really look forward to welcoming you in person soon to Limerick again, and to sitting down with you again. And to my own Chamber Chief Economist, Dr. Katrina Cahill, who is working tirelessly on our behalf at the moment, I'd like to say thank you for your insights today and for your ongoing work on behalf of the Chamber to develop independent policy proposals specifically targeting the Midwest and which we feel are of huge benefit to us in lobbying for the investment that we need in the Midwest to strengthen our regional economy. So Katrina, thank you for your ongoing work there. Okay, everyone, have a lovely weekend and thank you for joining us today.